Good morning, everyone. We are about to tackle a criminal law question dealing specifically with causation, assault, and the impact of voluntary intoxication on criminal responsibility. This video is meant for learning and reference only. Kindly go through the complete disclaimer before proceeding. Problem question. One day, India and Rehan go walking together in the mountains. At the top of the hill, Rehan tells India that he's going to kiss her. India, who has a strong moral and a religious principle, says, if you do, I shall jump. Rehan does not believe India and kisses her. India then jumps off the mountain and falls 20 meters onto the ledge, rendering her unconscious. Rahan goes to risk India. He carries her to his car, intending to take her to hospital. After traveling a few hundred meters, the car is involved in an accident with James, a drunk driver. Rehan goes out of the car, opens the door of the James car, and aims to punch at him. James, who is not thinking clearly due to his intoxication, pulls out a revolver and shoots Rehan through the shoulder. Both Rehan and India survive their respective injuries. We have to discuss the potential criminal liability of Rehan and James. First, we'll start with Rehan's criminal liability for India's injury. Rehan's action could potentially involve causing injury through recklessness or assault. India's decision to jump off the mountain after Rehan kissed her brings into play the issue of causation. In R versus Kennedy case number 2 in 2007, the House of Lords held that an individual's voluntary action, in that case like self-administering drugs, could break the chain of causation, thereby limiting the liability for the defendant. Similarly, India's voluntary decision to jump after Rehan kissed her may be considered an intervening act, as she jumped intentionally in response to Rehan's kiss, despite his lack of intention to cause her harm. In such cases, the issue of whether Rehan's conduct directly caused her injuries is complicated by her own voluntary actions. Under Section 6 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861, a causing grievous bodily harm, the GBH, is an offence. But the court may find that India's action for jumping broke the chain of causation if the court determines that Rehan's action lead to a forcible outcomes, that is, India's emotional distress, and jump was not entirely unreasonable. Rehan could be liable for causing the actual bodily harm under Section 47 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861. But the intervening voluntary acts like India's jump could reduce his liability. In this scenario, Rehan's action could potentially result in a criminal liability under the Offences Against the Persons Act OAP 1861, specifically for the common assault, occasioning the actual bodily harm, or even the grievous bodily harm. The first act to consider is Rehan kissing India, after she explicitly threatened her to jump if he did so. In this case, the kiss itself can be considered battery, which is defined under the Section 39 of Criminal Justice Act 1988 as an unlawful application of force. In R versus Thomas case in 1985, it was established that even a slight touch can be considered a battery if it is without consent. Although India started her opposition to the kiss. Rehan action of kissing her would constitute battery because it was an unwanted physical contact. However, the situation becomes more complex when considering the causation of India's jump from the mountain. The main legal question here is whether India's jump is an intervening act that breaks the chain of causation between the Rehan's battery, the case, and India's injury. The principle of causation in criminal law, as discussed in R versus Robert case in 1972, states that if the victim's act is reasonably foreseeable, the defendant remains liable. In Roberts, it was ruled that a victim's action in jumping out of a moving car did not break the chain of causation when the defendant conduct was sufficiently connected to the harm. Similarly, in R versus Kennedy case in 2007, it was held that a voluntary act by the victim, such as self-harm, could break the chain of causation only if the act was unforeseeable and extreme. Here, India's jump was not a random or unforeseeable action. She had explicitly threatened her to jump if kissed. Therefore, it is unlikely that a jump would break the chain of causation, and Rehan would likely be liable for causing this India's injuries, which could potentially amount to a grievous bodily harm if the injuries are serious enough, such as unconscious after falling 20 meters. Next, we will look into James' liability for the injury to Rehan. James, the drunk driver, causing injury to Rehan when he shoots him in the shoulder after Rehan attempts to punch him. James' liability primarily revolves around whether his voluntary intoxication impacts his action, whether his actions amounted to assault or grievous bodily harm. In RSS Mitski case in 1977, the House of Lords ruled that the voluntary intoxication does not provide a defense to crimes of basic intent such as assault or battery. Since assault is considered a basic intent offense, the fact that James was intoxicated and does not absolve him of liability for his actions. James, in his drunken state, pulled out a revolver and shot Rehan, which likely amounts to wounding or causing grievous bodily harm. Depending on the severity of the injury to Rehan's shoulder, even if the James was not thinking clearly due to his intoxication, recklessness could still be established as demonstrated in R versus Cunningham case in 1957, where the recklessness was defined as the defendant forcing the risk of harm and unjustifiably disregarding it. Given that shooting someone with a revolver is a highly dangerous act, James' intoxication does not negate the recklessness of his conduct. As a result, James is likely liable for wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm under Section 18 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861, or at least the grievous bodily harm under Section 20. In R versus Bolum case in 2004, it was determined that injury causing unconsciousness, particularly is a vulnerable victim, could amount to a grievous bodily harm. Thus, Rehan could be charged with Section 20 of OAPA 1861 for inflicting a grievous bodily harm, depending on the extent of India's juries. However, The issue of consent play a role as India did not consent to the case, even though Rahan might argue that did not intend serious harm. The focus is on whether the injury was a natural consequence of his actions, which it likely was. In Rahan's altercation with James, the first offense to consider is common assault. Section 39 of Criminal Justice Act 1988 defines the common assault as an intentional or the reckless act causing the victim to fear immediate unlawful force. When Rehan attempts to punch James, this could amount to an assault as per R versus Rena case in 1976, where it was established that an attempted punch, even if not successful, is sufficient to constitute an assault. Rehan's act of opening the door and aiming a punch at James, a reckless act, would qualify as a common assault, even though the punch does not land and James' intoxication does not negate the assault. As the key issue is Rehan's intent or the recklessness is trying to strike. Turning to the James action after Rehan attempts to punch him, James pulls out a revolver and shoots Rehan in the shoulder. Here, we must consider the charge of wounding or inflicting the actual bodily harm under Section 20 of OAPA 1860. Wounding involves a breaking the skin, and since Rehan was shot and suffered a wound, James could be liable for wounding with intent under Section 18 of OAPA 1861 or causing the grievous bodily harm under Section 20 of OAPA 1861. The James intoxication is a key issue here. As established in R versus Majeski's case in 1977, the voluntary intoxication is not a defense to the basic intent crimes, such as those under Section 20 of OAPA 1861, where the defendant need only be reckless regarding the consequence of their actions. James' act of shooting Rehan, although an overreaction to Rehan's punch, would likely be considered reckless, even if the James was intoxicated and his actions were still considered to involve the reckless infliction of the harm, making him liable for wounding under the Section 20 of OAP 1861. If the injuries to Rehan were more severe under the Section 18 of OAP 1861, wounding with intent could apply. However, the lack of intent to cause in serious harm may push the charge towards Section 20, as the key issue is whether James acted with intent to cause a serious harm. James' defense could argue that he acted in self-defense or the reaction to Rehan's punch, but this would need to be substantiated by the circumstances and his level of intoxication. However, the fact that James used a firearm in response to punch would likely outweigh any claim of self-defense and result in a conviction for wounding. The issue of causation arises throughout the scenario. For India's injury, the question is whether Rehan's action were the direct cause for her falling and becoming unconscious, or if her voluntary jump constituted an intervening act that broke the chain of causation. While India's jump was a voluntary, it could still be argued that Rehan's earlier action, the kiss, and the words that preceded it, set in motion of chain of events leading to her injury. In R versus Robert case In 1971, the court ruled that if the victim actions are a forcible result of the defendant's conduct, the chain of causation is not broken. If India's jump was a foreseeable outcome of Rehan's action, the chain of causation would remain intact. This would mean that Rehan might still be liable for an ABH, the actual bodily harm, even though India's voluntary jump was a contributing factor. For Rehan's injury, the chain of causation remains unbroken by James' intoxication, as Rehan's injury occurred as a direct result of James' act of shooting him. In this instance, a James intoxication, while it may have affected this judgment, and it does not negate his liability for the shooting. The issue of recklessness, as discussed in R versus Cunningham and R versus Majeski, established that James can still be held criminally responsible for the injury to Rehan. To conclude, Rehan's liability for India's injury is more complicated. He may be liable for actual bodily harm under the Section 7 of the Offences Act, Offences Against the Persons Act 1861. Though the intervening act of India's voluntary jump may complicate this causation, the court would need to assess whether the India's jump was a forcible consequence of the Rehan's conduct. James, on the other hand, is likely liable for grievous bodily harm under the Section 20 of the Offences Act, Offences Against the Persons Act 1861, or wounding with intent under Section 18. His voluntary intoxication does not provide a defense, and the act of shooting Rehan in response to being punched, even in a drunken state, is considered reckless and dangerous. The criminal liability of Rehan and James hinges on a number of factors, primarily the causation and the mentality of their actions. Rehan could face charges of GBH under Section 20 of OAPA 1861 for causing India's serious injuries by kissing her and potentially causing her to jump, as a jump would likely not break the chain of causation. In Rehan's encounter with James, the Rehans could face a common assault charge for his attempted punch, while James would likely face charges of wounding or inflicting the grievous bodily harm under the Section 20 of OAPA 1861. The James voluntary intoxication would not serve as a defense, and he could be convicted for recklessly causing harm to Rehan, even though James' initial response was not immediately fatal. Therefore, the both individuals could face serious charges, but the exact liability will depend on the specific facts presented to the court, including the mens rea and the severity of injuries caused. Ultimately, the principle of causation and recklessness, as outlined in the case law, particularly in R versus Cunningham in 1957 and R versus Majeski in 1977, plays a significant role in determining the liability of both Rehan and James for their respective injuries.